The work that the government's doing towards harmonization around regulatory cyber expectations is great. The work that BSI does around harmonization, partnering with other standards organizations and creating end-to-end solutions where we can capture the use of a standard and we can feed that data, insights and analytics back into that community to say, here's what's working well, here's what's not working well, here's where there's obvious gaps, here's a confusion around this terminology or people don't understand the importance of that. What do you want to do with that data? So it's less about passing an audit and more about bringing to life the data that comes from an audit. So that community of industry leaders, critical infrastructure stakeholders and regulatory and government authorities can look at the data, the insights and analytics and make better informed decisions about taking preventive measures moving forward.
You're listening to the ISF podcast for your organization's better cybersecurity. Your host, ISF CEO Steve Durbin, is an expert in leadership, business culture transformation, and cyber strategies for today's top enterprises. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. Today, Steve sits down with supply chain expert Neil Coole, who currently serves as Enterprise Partnership Director at BSI. Neil emphasizes the need to know your organization's supply chain story in order to stay secure and protect your brand. He and Steve talk about how regulation can go beyond a checklist and add real value for companies.
Neil, great to have you. Thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
You're something of an expert in supply chain risk management, and this is a topic that I'm constantly being asked about, not just within the ISF membership around the world, but pretty much wherever I tend to go and who I talk to, because it's a key challenge for a lot of organizations. So let's just start by getting your perspective. How has supply chain risk evolved and changed over the past couple of years?
It's a very important point, Steve. We've seen and heard from a lot of organizations, partners, trade bodies and associations that we work with. The pandemic highlighted a lot of vulnerabilities that a lot of organizations were not actively aware of. Many organizations, even today, don't know their supply chain story. And by that, I mean they don't know who their actual suppliers are, both direct suppliers and indirect suppliers. So an indirect supplier would be an invoicing entity, an agent, a trader, a stockist, or a broker. And a supplier would be someone that actually supplies something that you need, a component, an ingredient, a finished good, food, whatever it may be. So a lot of them don't know who their actual direct suppliers are, and that can expose certain risks, single points of failure. There's certain ethical considerations that they're being pressurized to shine more light on supply chain practices and behaviors, but also to understand disruptions. So the pandemic highlighted when the disruptions started to occur that a lot of supply chains started to fail. Organizations couldn't get critical ingredients or components or things that they'd taken, in many cases as a easy to get hold of piece. It really did kind of highlight some of those failures. Since then, we've also learned that geopolitical disruptions have also caused significant disruption in supply chains when organizations didn't realize, let's say, for example, in the agri-food sector, that a particular type of ingredient was only coming out of one region. That region might be in conflict, which means they no longer get that ingredient or that good or that component or whatever it may be. Again, it's not knowing their supply chain story presents issues and potential risks to that organization when unforeseen challenges do occur, and they do occur, whether it's a climate-related issue, a flood, a fire, a port closure, a strike, labor dispute, conflict. These things will always continue to challenge the world we live in. But if organizations don't know how it impacts their supply chain and where their supply is actually coming from, it can be very expensive and disruptive to those organizations.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges that people do talk to me a lot about is that one that you just laid out there, which is knowing their supply chain. What sort of advice can you give for people as to how they might better understand all of these different components that go into making that up? Because, we live in this hugely interconnected world now. And I think in the past, it was relatively simple for most organizations to understand what I would call their tier one suppliers. But it doesn't really matter what we're talking about, whether we're talking about food supplies, whether we're talking about technology. The supply chains have become so complex that it's very, very difficult to get your arms around exactly what's going on there and who's supplying what. So in your experience, what are the sorts of things that people can do to make that perhaps a little easier, or at least to get better level of visibility right the way across the chain?
That's a very good point. There are some solutions that organizations are starting to realize the positive impact they can have. like risk intelligence tools. So there are like solutions that you can purchase or subscribe to that highlight the world that we live in. You can overlay that with what you believe is your supply chain. And then from that, you can better understand when things are occurring, what impact, if any, it's going to have on things like trade routes, supply routes, roads. Cargo theft is a big one that we're working with at the moment to try and mitigate. Unfortunately, people are actively targeting certain supply routes because of the commodities being moved are considerably valuable, high net worth goods, food ingredients, alcohol, tobacco, things like that. But having that risk intelligence allows those clients to make better informed decisions about the routes they're going to take, the preventive measures that they can introduce. But it's just trying to give them more visibility in the supply chain. One of the other things, Steve, we're seeing is organizations historically have engaged suppliers and managed risk from a policy perspective. So, for example, I'm a US-based organization. I have to comply with certain regulations around, physical security, ethical sourcing, modern slavery risks, and so on. So I would send a policy document out to my suppliers saying, this is what I expect you to work to and adhere to, and you will send me a signed copy of that policy back to say that you agree with that and that you are a responsible corporate citizen and that you do follow those rules. Unfortunately, those organizations that do exist in supply chains that are prepared to break international law don't lose too much sleep about lying on a policy document. So we're seeing accounts in the media, reports being highlighted of very well-known brands, seeing cases of things like child labor, bonded labor, forced working conditions, things like that, that's causing significant harm and disruption to their brand because they just don't know what's actually going on in their supply chain. They don't go to the actual physical suppliers themselves. They rely on those indirect suppliers I mentioned earlier, those invoicing entities, those traders, stockists and brokers, because it's their job to go out and source those goods and services. But again, often they're never really going to those sites, those farms, those manufacturing facilities, those textile production centers, and actually seeing what goes on the ground. So the expectation now is on more trust, transparency, and also traceability, especially things like tech-enabled traceability. What kind of tech-enabled traceability solutions is that client using to determine where the goods are coming from, what route are they taking, who's opening up the cargo containers and possibly, adulterating goods, stealing in transit, all those other things. That's a real concern today for these organizations who are moving hundreds of thousands of freight containers on an annual basis. It's a real risk that they have to live with. The solutions are there. It's just helping those organizations understand the role that, standards, shall we say, a standard is a best practice framework, can play in helping to reduce or in some cases even mitigate some of those risks.
And one of the other things that certainly people talk to me about, where they're very frustrated, particularly the smaller organizations, is that very often there doesn't seem to be this tailoring, if you like, of the requirements that suppliers need to jump through. So a small supplier needs to jump through exactly the same hoops as a very large supplier. And it's not uncommon to, for smaller organizations to be, landed one day with a 200 to 300 page document that they've got to read through, understand, sign, and send back. And so I think there's also a degree of frustration that's in the mix, that perhaps there isn't the amount of intelligent tailoring, if I could put it that way, of some of the questioning that's needed. And I'm just wondering where you sit on that, because, you've touched on this issue of standards. Is perhaps that the answer? Are we going to sort of move down that particular road where we're going to trust more people if they at least can demonstrate a compliance with a standard or a policy? Or tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, that's why standards typically get created, Steve, is that there's a policy that's been introduced, there's a regulation that's been introduced to enforce the policy, and then the standard is really created as the how-to. So let's take something like ethical sourcing or modern slavery. That's a very contentious issue for understandable reasons. We don't want it in our supply chains. We don't want it in our world today. We don't want children being forced to work in an environment where it's unsafe or unethical for that, that kind of practice to be taking place. So there's a policy, there's a law, there's a regulation, but then there's also a standard. But whether it's a large organization or a small organization, the standard is there to help them use it depending on who they are, what resources they have, and what commitment they're looking to make for those clients they wish to serve moving forward. So the standards don't mind whether you're a sole trader or whether you're a global brand. It's just giving you the ability to use a best practice framework and provide the objective evidence that a customer, a retailer, an end consumer would benefit from to say, don't just take my word for it. We've had an independent, impartial body come in and assess my business against these following risks. This is the report that they've submitted. I've got some work to do, but here's what I can share with you today. And here's my plan for the future. Here's my roadmap for, better quality or better practices or reduced environmental impact or better security. I'm not perfect today. I've got some work to do. We would call that a corrective action plan. So we want to come in there and say, out of everything the standard requires you to do, there's certain areas here that you're not currently doing or you could do a better job of. Here's how you can go about, addressing those requirements for the foreseeable future. And you can use that to tell your story. So it's not about just, a certificate is very important. It demonstrates that someone has said that supplier A has met the requirements of that standard. But it's also what's your plan for the future? What's your roadmap look like for the future that I can benefit from as a buyer of your goods and services? So I have more trust and confidence in you rather than just relying on a policy document that says, I'm going to make a good product, or I'm not going to destroy the local environment. I'm not going to, sell your data. I'm not going to do things that I'm technically not allowed or legally not allowed to do. It gives me the objective evidence that I need from an independent third party who has no skin in the game to say, this is actually how they're performing. There's definitely areas for improvement, but, they're a low to no risk supplier for you. And therefore, you can make a better informed decision as a buyer on what kind of relationship you want with them moving forward.
One of the criticisms that I hear quite often, though, Neil, around this is that it's viewed as being a tick box exercise. It's compliance rather than anything else. And I mean, just interested on your take on that, frankly.
That's definitely one view that we've heard as well. When people talk about somebody issues a certificate and says, I passed an audit, that's great. Congratulations. But what's going on behind the scenes? What kind of measurements are you working towards? How did you perform in your first year? What areas for improvement are there? So that's more of an internal and supplier audit approach. You can still use the standard. You're just using it in a different way. I'm not looking to issue a accredited certificate as an outcome for that type of work. I'm looking to take something more meaningful and say, what are you actually doing for the future? Not what have you done in the past and what objective evidence have you provided to say, I pass an audit, but what are your plans for the next 3 years? How are you going to reduce your environmental impact, your energy consumption, your carbon footprint, your excessive working hours, the health and safety concerns that we may have for your site? Show me what your plans are looking like for the future that I can base future assessments on. That's a different way to use a standard outside of a typical conformity assessment outcome.
Right.
And clients and organizations, Steve, they're waking up to the use of standards. So yes, I do agree with your perspective. They have viewed standards as let's call it a tick box exercise, which some may see has been the case in the past. But other organizations are seeing standards as a great tool to then add their specific requirements to them to say, well, my goal of my supply chain is X. I'm adding that to this criteria. You're now going to incorporate that and show me how you're planning to be a better environmental steward for the future and what milestones you're expecting to achieve over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and how are you going to prove that? Minutes from board meetings, investment plans for the future, more sustainable energy sources, whatever it may be, you can now show me that, and then that independent party can come in and verify that I'm doing the right things that I've said I'm going to do for that future.
And it does provide, doesn't it, something of a roadmap for people who, frankly, may not know how to get started. We're talking about some fairly complex and evolving and emerging issues here, particularly when we get into the whole environmental space. And that varies so much around the world, doesn't it? So, providing some of that, at least, guidance in how to get started, what good looks like, and then taking it beyond, as you rightly point out, is probably not a bad place for a lot of organizations to be.
Absolutely.
Now, you recently launched a new initiative to help strengthen the security and resilience of critical US infrastructure sectors. What can you tell us about that program?
So we partner with an organization called Mission Critical, who's a non-profit organization, does a lot of really important analytics and research and insights and white papers on important topics associated with cybersecurity against critical infrastructure. Unfortunately, the reality is, critical infrastructure is going to get targeted for a variety of reasons, whether it's economically motivated or there's a malicious, intent behind it, especially in countries like the US, because if you can disrupt something like the food supply, access to healthcare, utilities have been targeted in the past. Unfortunately, people are in reaction mode. They've reacted to these incidents occurred. Most of them, Steve, have been economically motivated. Somebody's hacked into a facility, they've taken control of it, and they want to be paid in some kind of ransom Bitcoin payment to release or give back control of that operation, that infrastructure. Unfortunately, that won't always be the case. Maybe they take control of a food production plant and their motivation isn't economic. They want to change the temperature in how something's made. So that product comes out at the end of the day. We think it's safe, and we don't know it's not until consumers start falling ill, or even worse cases could occur. So we can't assume that every motivation behind an attack is going to be economically motivated. So working with Mission Critical, we're able to highlight what's happened, what's going on from a regulatory standpoint, working with they've got some fantastic connections within the US government, learning about what's going on around things like regulatory harmonization. Because if you're a CISO in a very large, complex organization, the way it's been explained to me, Steve, it's like whack-a-mole. They're constantly trying to adhere to overlapping and in some cases conflicting regulatory requirements, all focused on things like cybersecurity. That must be an incredibly difficult position for a CISO and the CISO's team to be in, when ultimately they're just trying to keep things safe. So the work that the government's doing towards harmonization around regulatory cyber expectations is great. The work that BSI does around harmonization, partnering with other standards organizations and creating end-to-end solutions where we can capture the use of a standard and we can feed that data, insights and analytics back into that community to say, here's what's working well. Here's what's not working well. Here's where there's obvious gaps. Here's a confusion around this terminology, or people don't understand the importance of that. What do you want to do with that data? So it's less about passing an audit and more about bringing to life the data that comes from an audit. So that community of industry leaders, critical infrastructure stakeholders, and regulatory and government authorities can look at the data, the insights and analytics, and make better informed decisions about taking preventive measures moving forward. You can still have a certified outcome, but it just means that data now comes to life rather than just relying on as you mentioned before, Steve, I've got a certificate, it's viewed as a tick box exercise. That can be a more useful use of the data that's captured and gathered through an assessment framework.
And I think you used a word there, harmonization. That's absolute music to most CISOs' ears, I think. I think one of the big challenges is the fact that, particularly if you're a multinational organization, that we seem to be moving away from harmonization rather than towards it. And that's, as you rightly point out, a massive frustration for pretty much anybody who is trying to do the right thing from a regulatory perspective. Neil, how prepared and resilient do you think infrastructure sectors in the US are?
That's a good question, Steve. From my humble perspective, we're very fortunate to work with a variety of different critical infrastructure stakeholders. I would view, this is my personal opinion, I would view sectors like energy and the finance sector to be on the more mature end. And when we look at others like, let's say, agriculture and food, healthcare and utilities, they might be on the less mature because they tend to be targeted more. So if we look at the more appealing targets, put ourselves in the perspective of an attacker, would I go after a financial institution knowing how resilient they are, how they've been attacked in the past, the lessons they've learned, and the preventive measures that they've introduced? I'm not going to be as successful as I would be had I go after someone on the less mature end of the critical infrastructure list who don't have as much experience with these types of things, who haven't been actively targeted over the last few decades, but I can still achieve my goal. Again, thinking, Steve, from the point of the attacker, I want the path of least resistance. So I'm looking at legacy infrastructure in something like a food production facility. Very easy to get into that, very easy to take over control, very easy to get paid. So there's opportunities for improvement everywhere, but from a maturity standpoint, we do view, parts of the critical infrastructure sectors like energy and finance to be of the more mature end. And then there's a few in the middle that are learning some important lessons. And then there's those who are actively being targeted, we read about all the time. They are the ones that I feel would benefit more from some of the guidance and support and information that's available for them to be less of an attractive target.
And when we look at government, because when we talk about critical infrastructure, of course, government tends to get involved for better or worse. In your experience, how effective do you think government leaders are in first of all, understanding the issue, because clearly that's the starting point, but then helping as opposed to hindering organizations to actually get to a point where they are sharing the most relevant information, they are building out much more resilient approaches to really becoming, as you say, unattractive to cyber criminals?
I think the government is, and again, please take this on board, Steve, that I've lived in the United States for coming up to 7 years. So I'm still learning an awful lot about federal and state government entities, agencies. There's a lot of them. The ones that we've had the opportunity to speak with, they're all very passionate about a very safe and prosperous United States. And that's great to see and hear. The challenge comes when you've got these various entities and agencies that aren't always sharing information of what's going on within their purview. So they'll see things from a physical or cyber security risk perspective that others may benefit from, but there's no sharing of information. So I'll give you an example. If there's somebody using the food supply chain to smuggle in fentanyl, that would benefit everyone. Anyone in the food sector would need to think, hang on a minute, am I a risk? Is there a risk to my supply chain from a food defense perspective of having intentional adulteration in my supply chain so people can smuggle in, narcotics or whatever it may be, disguise it as an ingredient that we're going to use to produce food? That has happened, but that's not something you would read about from, let's say, the FDA or the USDA. That would be more Customs and Border. So again, it's knowing that there's really useful information there. These organizations have the best intentions at heart, but sometimes that broader information isn't being shared. That's one of the things that I really like on a personal level, Steve, is when we use standards to capture data, you see everything. You see everything that's going on within that industry, within that organization, within that country. That information can be shared in a completely open, trusted, and transparent manner, so everyone can see what's going on and determine what information is most relevant to them and what do they want to do with that moving forward to have a positive outcome. So it's kind of breaking down some of the silos, and that they're unintentional, of course, but they do exist, where it's just the information is available. You're a government department, you want to make sure that, let's say, agriculture is prospering. We understand that there's a need to evolve and embrace more technological advancements around things like use of water, energy, crop yields, things like that. Well, innovation and AI and all these other exciting things play an important role there. But if there's risks in there as well, you want to see those risks. You don't want to rely on a single law enforcement or government entity that may only be focused on anything to do with data security, not food safety. You want to see everything. And that can come through the use of a standard or a number of standards. You might use several to highlight, production quality, food safety, information security, and just openly share all that information together. That's why the partnership with Mission Critical made so much sense to us. It's all about what's best for critical infrastructure. How can we learn from what's happened? How can we see what's going on today? And how can we use that information to better inform decisions for the future?
Now, you've made the point that you've been living in the United States for the past 7 years, but you're originally from the UK and you've spent time in New Zealand, Australia. So you've got something of a global perspective on this. Is there anyone that you would call out as being sort of a shining light in this space from a government standpoint? Somebody that you think is really, cracked that sort of way in which you can communicate some of the challenges, spread some of the necessary information, incorporate the different standards? Anybody who's doing it absolutely spot on or better?
I don't. This is my humble opinion, Steve, and I want this to sound negative, but no, I don't think any one government department anywhere in the world right now has got it down to what we would call perfect with no room for improvement. There's obviously room for improvement. There is one organization that we work with in a partnership form. It's called the Supplier Compliance Audit Network, or SCAN. They're an organization. It's a community of US-based retailers, brand owners, people that rely on a very healthy, secure supply from outside the US to come in, and they meet a Customs and Border Protection requirement called CTPAT, or the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. That community has taken that single standard, that single government requirement, and they've created a harmonized assessment framework. So if I'm a supplier into, let's say, Target, Home Depot, and Disney, historically, all three of them would need to assess my business wherever I am in the world against that requirement. That requires a lot of impact on me as a supplier, a lot of cost, a lot of disruption. Through the work that this organization has done, it's now a single assessment framework. So if I'm supplying into one of them and all the others are members, they just know that I've had an assessment, I've passed the assessment, I'm a trusted supplier. They don't need to require anything more of me. They can see a copy of my report, my certificate, they can see everything. It's open and shared and completely transparent. And they don't need to enforce any additional requirements on me because they know I've already passed the assessment that they would have required. That was recognized by CBP. That was recognized as a best practice of what an effective harmonized assessment framework and community could look like. So whilst it's not led by the government, it's led by industry. These are industry leaders out of the biggest brands and retailers you would imagine to see within the United States. By partnering with us and working together in collaboration, that is seen as, I would describe as best practice for a harmonized assessment framework where you've reduced audit fatigue and disruption in the supply chain by more than 50%. You're saving that community a significant amount of money in unnecessary assessments and travel, T&E expenses, and so on. That's something that is a great case example of where we could learn some important lessons, but then use other standards. What other standards or what other communities would benefit from a harmonized, shared assessment framework against a single risk lens, whether it's sustainability or cybersecurity, AI ethics, bias, privacy, the list goes on, Steve. But all those organizations have the same requirements. They all approach it individually today. So if you're a single supplier working for the top 10 biggest brands, the top 10 are sending out some form of assessment of you. Like you mentioned before, Steve, you're getting that 300-page assessment document, not just from one supplier, you're getting it from all the suppliers. But if those suppliers become part of the same community and they agree to accept a single assessment outcome, no matter who's instigated it, everyone benefits. The supplier benefits, minimizes their disruption. They get to work with more brands in an open and trusted environment. And it just saves that complete disruption and unnecessary costs of delivering an assessment by multiple brands.
And certainly from our standpoint, from the ISF point of view, that's something that we've been working with our members on for quite some while now with our supplier assessment tools and our standard good practice that look at all of these different standards and try to make life just a little easier, share common information right the way across our global membership. So good to hear that we've been on the right track.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely the right track.
Yeah. Fantastic. Neil, look, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing some insights there into some of the challenges of supply chain and also lastly, of course, pointing out what good actually does look like. So it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thank you, Steve.
Special thanks to this week's guest, Neil Coole. In the meantime, if you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and we'd be pleased if you'd consider sharing the episode. To become a member, get in touch with Steve directly at steve.durbin@securityforum.org or on LinkedIn. Check out all our media and resources. All of it is there to support you at securityforum.org. Don't miss our other podcast, Dear InfoSec, sharing conversations with members about the real-world applications of ISF research. The ISF podcast is produced by TalkBox Productions and Tavia Gilbert. Thanks for listening.